Okay, everybody, hello and welcome to our program and presentation. My name is Lance Strate. I'm the president of the Institute of General Semantics.
Yay!
Yay!
Yay! We love you!
I'm also the past president of the New York Society for General Semantics. And while we're at it, I'm also professor of communication and media studies at Fordham University. We know what side of our bread's buttered. Okay. Well, I want to welcome all of you who are here with us tonight at the Players Club. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. And I want to welcome as well those of you who are watching these proceedings via our live stream. And also for those of you that were here with us in October, welcome back. Back in October, we held our annual Alfred Krzyzewski Memorial Dinner and our Science, Sanity, and the Semantic Environment Symposium. Thanks. And once again, I want to thank all of you who are members of the Institute of General Semantics and encourage you all to be members if you're not yet. Your annual dues cover a subscription to our journal, etc., edited by Tom Gencarelli, as well as a variety of other benefits, including admission to the AKML and the accompanying dinner. Let me take this occasion to make public for the first time that this year's AKML will take place on Friday evening, October 7th, followed by a symposium on the 8th and 9th. And the speaker will be astrophysicist and author Jana Levin. You won't want to miss it, so save that date, October 7th. Did you save it?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I also want to take this moment to acknowledge our camera crew from Manhattan College, Marissa Kennedy and Tian Tran, and Tom Gencarelli as well. Thank you, guys. And also Mike Clue, who is the president now of the New York Society for General Semantics, and just recently was given, for some reason that no one can fathom, tenure and promotion at Manhattan College. Congratulations, Mike. Now, on to the presentation of the S.I. Hayakawa Book Prize, named for the author of the most popular book on general semantics, Language and Thought in Action. Each year, the Institute of General Semantics awards the S.I. Hayakawa Book Prize in the amount of $1,000. Very good. They're very teachable.
Yes, they learn.
So it's awarded to an outstanding work on a topic of direct relevance to general semantics. This year's winner is a popular book grounded in linguistics and etymology, and I'll add that it is one that references Alan Walker Reed, a major intellectual figure and contributor to general semantics and to the Institute. In general semantics, we're concerned not only with the meaning of words, but the ways in which we respond to them, our semantic reactions. And some of the strongest and most irrational semantic reactions are reserved for words that we deem offensive, that are taboo, are curse words and bigot words. It takes more than a little courage to write a book about those kind of words. But that's exactly what this year's winning publication is all about. And it's only by confronting these words that we can gain a measure of control over them and over ourselves. The title of the book selected for the Hayakawa Prize is 9 Nasty Words, English in the Gutter, Then, Now, and Forever. The author is an associate professor at Columbia University, a frequent contributor to a variety of magazines and newspapers, including The Atlantic, Time Magazine, and the New York Times, and the author of numerous books. So please join me in congratulating John H. McWhorter.
very much to the Society for giving me this award, which I'm assuming might stand up. And as I gradually see that it doesn't, I'm going to fake my way through. So there you go. And thank you very much for this award. It's not something that you expect when you write a book that anybody's going to give you a prize for it. And to tell you the truth, this is the honest truth, and it's not that it's supposed to be all about the meaningless details of my life, but I am 56 years old, and this is actually the very first prize I have ever received for anything in any real way since I was 10 years old. Thank you very much. Thank you. And I've gotten a couple of things because I was there and I was kind of in line and it wouldn't have been right not to give it to me. Those didn't count. This is the first time somebody has singled me out and thought, this was good. So I really am very touched to have this self-standing award. And Nine Nasty Words was designed actually to get linguistics lessons across without people knowing, kind of like when you give a Labrador medicine wrapped in peanut butter or something like that. I wanted the world to understand basic linguistic concepts without knowing that they were getting medicine. And I figured that the best way to do it would be to do something about profanity. And then I gradually realized that my sense of what profanity is extends to the N-word and other words of abuse, and that in my mind, I really did think of those things as today's profanity, rather than what we call them as slurs. And I figured that would be of a certain interest in modern American society. And so I wrote it, and I remember right before the pandemic happened, I was down to, if I may, the chapter on faggot. I wrote that chapter very, very quickly because as soon as I heard on the radio that there would be possibly school closings, I thought they're going to close the schools, and for various reasons, I'm going to be the one who's home with what were at the time my 4 and 7-year-old. And so I wrote the chapter really quickly, and if you read the book, you can tell that that one doesn't quite hang together the way the other ones do, because it's me thinking, when is de Blasio going to ruin my life? But that is what happened with Nine Nasty Words. I got it in just under the gun, under the door, and here it is. And people seem to kind of like it, and I've been very tickled, and thank you very much for this formal acknowledgement of what for me was just sharing my toys. That's what this is. So thank you.
Now, let me note that we have a limited number of copies of the book that are on sale at a substantially discounted price because we want you to buy them, and that it is cheaper than getting it on Amazon. So if you don't get it now, you'll just regret it later.
But help put my children through daycare.
And John has kindly consented to sign copies afterwards.
Thank you.
Now, as you may know, the winner of the 2021 Hayakawa Prize was announced at the 2021 AKML, which is, we're in 2022 now. So unfortunately, John was not able to join us then. And so we decided to hold this belated presentation of the award at a later date and take the opportunity to couple it with an event of interest to the general semantics community, because we always love to take advantage of these things. So here we are. So now let me introduce our panel discussion entitled Totem and Taboo in Contemporary Talk. General semantics has long been concerned with the ways in which people react to words and symbols, with our semantic reactions and how those reactions all too often involve mistaking words for things. This is particularly true for words and symbols that are considered taboo and words and symbols that hold totemic value in regard to group identity. Language colors the way that we view the world, the way that we relate to our environment, and the way that we interact with others. So in talking about talk, we can take a look at the talk that may set us off and the talk that can set us free. Let me introduce the panelists for this discussion. At the other end of our table is Vasu Varadhan, an associate faculty member in the Gallatin School of Individualized Study at New York University. the author of On My Own Terms, A Journey Between Two Worlds.
Thank you.
And I'll just add that, like myself, Vasu was one of Neil Postman's students and a graduate of the old NYU Media Ecology
Yes.
program.
I was senior to Lance, though. In more ways than one, can I say that? No, we were good classmates, good friends,
Yes.
still are.
Next to Vasu is Michelle Prettyman, an assistant professor of communication and media studies at Fordham University, my colleague, and an affiliate faculty member in the Department of African and African American Studies. Also co-founder of the Daughters of Eve, Eve Media Consulting Firm. And finally, once more, John H. McWhorter. What's H stand for?
Hamilton.
Oh, okay.
And I'm the fifth. You can trace them all the way back. The first one was a slave. The second one was a sharecropper. The third one was a cook. The fourth one was dad. The fifth one is me. The sixth one is named Vanessa. So go all the way through.
Vanessa Hamilton, it has a nice root.
Literally, she's Vanessa.
Really? I thought you were joking.
Because Jean didn't work. You know, we had to give up the John, and so it became Vanessa Hamilton. So,
Wow. Well, John, again, is an associate professor at Columbia University, where he teaches linguistics, American studies, and music history. He's the author of over 20 books, including last year's 9 Nasty Words, and 2 books last year, and,
never doing that again.
and Woke Racism.
Don't say that.
Some of his previous books include Our Magnificent Bastard Tongue. You're already getting started with
That
that.
was my favorite.
Yeah. Words on the Move, Losing the Race, and The Language Hoax. He writes twice weekly for the New York Times and hosts the linguistics podcast Lexicon Valley. You can applaud again. And so I'll start things off. And again, we're going to start based on 9 nasty words. And so the question that immediately springs to mind, John, is what the fuck?
There are actually 12 words, but that didn't have any alliteration. And fuck was one of them. But what interested me was that you could tell the story of profanity and have a narrative thread. And so it starts with words about God and religion, and then you add the words about the body and excretion. And then I think it's moved into slurs against subordinated groups. And so you have a story of what the notion of profanity is and how it's developed through the ages. And that allows you to bring in the George Carlin words and then some others. And things have changed in many ways. And so, for example, one of Carlin's, if I may, was cocksucker. And I thought to myself, I've never used that word. I don't think people who are my age or younger use it that much. I thought to myself, it's a little bit archaic at this point. I thought, I'm not going to do a chapter on that. I'm going to fold it into something else. But still, it did surprise me how little the list has changed since Carlin's day in other ways. But I wanted to add what we call the slurs, because I think that they subsume under the same analysis. So that's what it was. And I thought that I could give the general public etymologies, because everybody likes etymology, but the etymology of something like fuck or shit is more fun than the etymology of, alligator or door. There was an earlier word than door, and it meant through. Well, isn't that interesting? The ones with profanity are much more interesting. And often I didn't know. I hadn't really thought about the etymology of motherfucker. And so you have to look these things up. So I got to learn things too. These are not things I have usually shared with class. These are things that you kind of keep to yourself. And so I learned a lot too. And I just thought you have to share it. And a lot of what's in 9 Nasty Words is actually the grandmother's attic part of my mind, because I like old comic strips, silent films, ancient books nobody even read then. I'm always going through those things where you find profanity. And so often I would think, actually, I know an earlier example of this word or that word because Blondie said it, or because it's in this novel from 1890. So I got to put my garbage into it as well, which was fun too. Old radio shows and things like that. So it was just, it was an adventure writing 9 Nasty Words.
Well, why do we have these kind of words? I mean, do we always have them?
We always have them. There is no such thing as a culture that doesn't have the profane in some sense, as in there is a way of transgressing what are thought to be ordinary norms of respect or boundaries or observance of that which is sacred. Every language does it in different ways. It's not always about words about excretion or words about religious figures, but it's always there. The question is what the profanity is going to be about. So Japanese barely has what we would call profanity, but they strike the same chord by manipulating how honorifically or not people are addressed. Where we would yell off some word, they will use a pronoun differently and create the same flavor. So it's there in every language. Ours seems normal to us, but it's peculiar. It's a European-y thing for it to be all about God and the body. That's something that some languages do, others don't. We're used to that. But yeah, profanity is universal. It's part of what real language and real people are.
And how do they change then?
Well, in our times, what has changed is that at first, the way one was profane was to swear in vain to, for example, a deity. That was the worst thing that you could do, especially in a largely pre-literate culture where swearing, as in attesting to something orally, was the equivalent of signing something on a piece of paper, which most people couldn't do. So these things were not taken lightly. Then exactly why things like shit and fuck, etc., became profane is something that people argue about. It has something to do with evolving notions of privacy and individuality during the Reformation. It may be partly architecture, and that rooms got smaller and people spend more time alone. Various theories, none of which I could find authoritative, but certainly in about the 1500s, you start getting a sense that these words about the body and what comes out of it and what goes into it, etc., are less salty than unthinkable, and they drop out of print, and it becomes hard to document exactly what was going on. And then the real story is, I think many people think, suddenly people started using profanity more after about 1966, and now we use profanity a lot. My sense is not that we use it more, it's that it's lost its power, because our sense of what's profane now is less about God or the body than about matters sociological, such as how you deal with battling power differentials. And I think it's almost predictable that that's what profanity would be about now, particularly now in 2022. But you could have seen this coming even in the 1970s. And so that means that the fact that I say F-U-C-K several times a day, and I'm a very reserved person with lazy boy chairs who listens to old music, and yet I say fuck all the time. Not for effect, but because I think it's normal among people of my demographic. My parents didn't use the word as much. For them, that word was shit. Things have changed that someone like me says that word that much. It's because it isn't profane. It's because the real profanity are things that I don't say. And we've witnessed that change at the end of the 20th century, is my analysis in that book.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, I like your reference to orality and literacy, and I know you cited
The
on,
best book in the world.
which we're big fans of. Certainly the power of speech, is swearing when you say it out loud. But I was also thinking about media, the contemporary media, because for me, I know like a big change happened with The Sopranos. And I was watching The Sopranos religiously, and that's where I suddenly felt okay about saying something like "what the fuck" and doing it in the classroom where I
Stole my fucking car.
never would before. But I was also thinking about comedy, and I was actually surprised that you didn't mention this. But of course, and everyone's a critic after you really must look. But the movie Lenny, thinking about Lenny Bruce, and I actually show it in my language class, a clip from it where which Dustin Hoffman playing the role of Lenny Bruce, and he's got this routine where he's going around using bigot words, using the N word in particular, but also words for bigot words for Jews, Hispanic people, and Italians and so forth. And with the intent of being offensive and making people nervous, but then coming out and saying if we didn't invest these words with such power, nobody would get upset, and a little kid would come home crying because they were called that word. And I was wondering how you felt about that idea, because it seems to me to be very much in tune with general semantics. I don't know if Lenny Bruce ever encountered general semantics directly. It's quite possible because it was a popular thing back at that time. But it was definitely a message that was consonant with general semantics to not put power into words, but take control of them ourselves. And he also does that with the body terms as well. But
Yeah.
the bigot ones are the ones that really hit home.
Lance, the truth is that I know that Bruce routine. I've seen clips of the real one. I didn't include it because it was kind of like what I had already said about Carlin. And I wrote the introduction in a hurry because I wanted to get to the curses. And the other reason, I'm going to admit this. That book, Look Homeward Angel by Thomas Wolfe, that is so famous. Have you read it? Nobody's read it. I only read it 2 years ago, hated it. And it's one of those books that people talk about, but often haven't read. I never saw the movie Lenny. I have to admit, I haven't actually seen it. And so it wasn't as vivid in my mind. That's the 50% of the reason.
Yeah, I kind of figured that. I figured if you had seen it, it
would be fresh.
It would be in there.
I promise that in the second edition of this, I'll put it in because there'll be a second edition.
You all are my witness. Well, Michelle, would you?
Well, I'm wondering though if you've seen The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel.
That I've seen.
Yes, clap for that. Because I find it interesting that they've revived this kind of interest in Lenny Bruce. And I'm interested in that show and the way that the female comic, right, owns language a particular way that feels fresh, but it always makes me think about this question of sort of whether or not historically that was the way that people would have talked. My assumption is that she is completely ahistorical. But I know that I'm wrong. I'm sure that women talked that way, but I don't know about middle-class Jewish women.
No, that is a wonderful, wonderful show. And she's doing a combination of Phyllis Diller and Jean Carroll. And you can see Jean Carroll, and Jean Carroll was funny, but she did not do that. A woman simply was not allowed. It's fun for us to watch that happen, but no, women didn't go blue, as they called it, to that extent. Only guys could do it.
Yeah, it feels that way, but I guess the interesting thing is you talk about how Black women over the years have used language. You go back, of course, to the blues singers, right? Certainly there are many reasons why contextually Black women would have both owned that capacity and then were also socially, I don't think there was an allowance, but I guess I'm wondering what's the nuance there? Because are we suggesting that historically women had to stay in a certain place, even having access to kinds of privilege? Yes, we would probably say yes, but I do think that there is a kind of radical nature of certainly the blues, but Black culture in general that has always appropriated language in particular ways that was far more freeing, right, than people of a certain class, caste, right? So maybe we could talk about that a bit more, like why you think that was an opening for Black women in particular, but certainly, Mrs. Maisel would not have been able to do that.
No, and what's hard about it is that there's a difference between what happened in performance and what people did when the cameras and the mics were going on. And from what you hear, people like Bessie Smith and Dinah Washington were saltier off mic than we can ever hear them now. And so the idea, I think to an extent, is that well, it's okay for Black people because they're different. We don't expect as much from them. But on the other hand, Black people themselves were enjoying this sort of thing very much. And so you could say that the contrast is that the more general society was just more uptight and less like almost all of us are now. But a lot of it is that you have to listen to what people say about what happened in real life as opposed to what we see when they've got the cameras on. That's the hard part.
Yeah, because just, speaking from a middle-class Jewish perspective, that, one of the kind of resources that women and men had available to them was a different language, so that there are curses in Yiddish, like kishmi and tuchus, which is like kiss my ass, right? But and tuchus is tush, that got absorbed into English. So, and there's something about that distancing. Like my mother had all sorts of things that she would say that, and some of it was in other languages too. So, and having that resource, which, then either people don't know what you're saying, or it's, but it's also that thing of curse words in other languages that, right, merit doesn't have the impact for English speakers that it does.
Exactly.
French speakers.
That's true.
Right.
Yeah, one of the things too I was interested in is sort of, the class issue. Because I know, coming from India as I do, people who use curse words, or normally they would say, a common way of accusing somebody would say you're speaking fisherwoman's or fisherman's language, what you say, gutter. And I wondered, like the New York Times doesn't use the F word, and, the recent incident at the Oscars, they bleeped everything out. And I wondered if you thought about, the use of class and its relationship to profanity.
Yeah, what's interesting is how that changes starting at about the middle of the 20th century, because I think you could easily have said 100 years ago that profanity was associated with people of a lower class, people who are digging ditches, people who are working people, as opposed to, say, the people who would have been in this room 100 years ago. Then there's this democratization of language in general. And it's the time when people stop wearing hats and girdles and stop doing dances with steps. And there's a whole informality that comes in, particularly in the late 60s, and it becomes entrenched in the 70s. And that's when I think that class distinction starts to erode. And it's less likely that you would tell somebody that in using those words, you're low class. If anything, you're proving your authenticity to use those words. And once again, though, there's the issue of what was official versus what happened in real life. One way you can catch people cursing who didn't consider themselves to be low class is if you look at blooper reels of old movies, where if they mess up, what do they say? And they curse. Now, none of them say F-U-C-K. They don't say that, but they do say shit, and they do say son of a bitch. And so there was more than we like to think. However, there was still a sense that anybody who used those words all the time, just casually, was talking like a sailor. Yeah, that changes after the 60s, here at least.
And what would account for the Times still sticking to its
The
code?
what?
The New York Times still refusing.
Because it's the gray lady, and the gray lady, and they consider themselves to have a certain kind of authority. But that's slowly breaking down. It's at the point, my sense is that the people at the Times know that that's going to have to stop at some point. But they're thinking of themselves as the grand leftover stewards of the best of the culture. But it's become archaic. I find it difficult to write around those things sometimes. I now know they're not going to print the word. The word would be perfect with the rhythm here, but they can't print it. They know that that's getting a little odd at this point. But somebody has to be the last bastion.
It's not us.
Well, it's certainly when you mention blooper reels, think of Nixon's tapes.
Yeah.
And, and there's the real kind of disjunction between how he
Official
spoke.
reality.
Yeah.
Official presentation. Although even then, he's usually drunk on bourbon. And so he's somewhat loose, but still, yeah, that's real speech. And he was somebody who walked around in suits and did important things. Yeah.
Yeah. And in contrast to, can I say the name Trump? I mean, that feels like a dirty word.
But he was a person of the post-60s, and that's part of why he used the language that he did. Partly it's because he was him, but he was also a modern United States president. Combine his temperament with modernity, and you get that potty mouth of his. So glad he's gone. Because you had to write about him all the time. If you were a language person, every time he opened his mouth, you had to write something or say something. And that I knew as soon as he was elected, I thought all linguists are going to have to talk about him all the time. And that's exactly what happened for blissfully 4 years.
Now, how did you do that?
With occasionally bourbon of my own. You had to work on your creativity.
Well, I thought it was interesting that you, because when you talk about the shift in what is considered the worst word, where, again, we started with fuck, so, I mean, that is no longer as taboo as it once was. And, so I'm not going to do the N word, but I found that to be something I hadn't thought about before. And it, made me think that when you take that N word, John Lennon had a song, right? Woman is the N word of the world. And I remember back in the punk days, Patti Smith had a song where she, I don't know, it's Brian, do you know what that song is?
It's called Rock and Roll N-Word.
Okay. Yeah, so, and where she
Let's just
uses,
go with that one, like rock and roll N-word.
and that has, so that was still acceptable. Now, they were using it not to denigrate anyone, but rather as a kind of identifying mark of anyone who is subject to prejudice and oppression.
It's become a taboo word. It's a magic word. And it's easy to think of that as peculiar. I think it frustrates some people, the idea that you can't even utter it, even to condemn it. But on the other hand, there are magic words in just about any society. And if I had to choose that as a magic word over the magic words being about excretion or religion, I would choose that. And I think it goes a bit overboard, and I have written editorials about that. I don't think people should be losing their jobs over referring to the word briefly. But I understand the basic impulse, and it really is the sort of thing where there's an episode of the Dick Van Dyke Show, it's 1963, and little Richie, the poor guy who could never act, but little Richie has said a bad word at school. And it's 1963, they can't ever say what the word was, but it's clear from the context that it was F-U-C-K. I think many people under about 40 today would see that episode and assume that he had written the N-word from the way Rob and Laura talk about it. Rob does this whole speech about how they're worried that their child is embracing evil. And it's not the N-word, it's F-U-C-K. It was a magic word then. We've just switched out what word we feel that way about. And to be honest, as wonderful as the Dick Van Dyke Show was, seeing them having that response to F-U-C-K looks quaint. You kind of want them to get over it. You kind of figure Richie's not evil, he's just a kid. Whereas with the N-word, I can take that more seriously. And so, you just choose what the wrinkles in the society are going to be. It's kind of the Enoch-Etic distinction. And so that's the way I look at it these days.
Can we talk a little,
Sorry.
go ahead.
No, I was just, like an incident happened to me 2 years ago. I was teaching, and I was involved in a project with high school students in the inner city schools, and I was training mentors to teach them about an Indian epic, the Ramayana. And the high school students had to put on a project at the end of the program. And they had decided to use different types of music in the mouths of the characters of the epic. And one of them used a Drake song that had the N-word in it for one of the characters. And then the night before, I got an email from the program coordinator who wanted to know if I would feel offended by having these lyrics, and I said no, I sort of didn't believe in censorship, and I said that's fine, I was okay with it. Anyway, the program went on and everything else, and I was teaching, and some students in my class said, "Hey, Vasu, how did the program go?" And I said the lyrics, that Drake said, and I said, imagine, these lyrics were put in the mouth of this character in the epic. And a student walked in. She was a student from Haiti. And after class, she came up to me and she said, "You said the N-word." And I said, "When did I say the N-word?" Because and then I said, "I've never really used it, towards anybody, never used it as a slur or profanity or, as far as I could tell." And she said, "No, I heard you use the N-word." So I said, "No," I said, "I was repeating the lyrics that were in the Drake song that the student uttered." And she said she did not want to listen to the context in which this occurred. And I apologized I didn't feel sorry, to be honest, but I apologized because I was afraid it would escalate. And then these things go to the dean of the school, and then you get hauled in because you used a word you're not supposed to use. And I find all of this extremely problematic in terms of, the word is not the thing, but I also find nowadays that the word there's no nuanced perception of the word, and it seems almost decontextualized. And how to address that issue.
Yeah, within this company in particular, where we're thinking about general
But in
semantics.
academia too, you're constantly receiving emails, from the institution about the gender pronouns, about, using, any kind of, language that can trigger students. And there's times when I feel like it's almost self-censoring. Like I'm so very careful about, sometimes I'm not sure what word to use, but, this kind of bothers me, in the sense that the student only focused on the fact that I had repeated a word that, a Black rap artist had used, it was in his lyrics. And, where does one draw the line here?
There's a tacit sense in modern American society that to be an enlightened person is to pretend not to understand the difference between use and reference with that one word.
Mhm.
I'm not sure we can do anything about that, but you're supposed to pretend that you don't know the difference. And I actually just gave a talk about matters of that kind last week at a very nice conference, and was very explicit about the difference between use and reference and made some remarks. And one of the questions from a PhD person in the audience was from someone who I can only say, as brilliant as this person was, somebody who was studiously pretending not to understand the difference and asked a polite but pointed question. And I thought to myself, she must know what I'm talking about, but she feels a responsibility to pretend otherwise. And I think that's what I mean by magic word. And I think there are good things about it as well as annoying things, but it can be annoying. Yes, I know what you mean.
I guess I would, want to sort of follow that thread though, because to your point, yes, absolutely use and reference. But I think part of what the challenge is for so many young people is that they've lived in a world where there was very little concern paid to any of this as far as they are concerned. And so recently, and for us, certainly this is not we have a very different relationship to this moment and to the word. We have a longer history with the word, with ER and A, both N words, which I think we have to talk about as well. But I think even with my students and my Black students, there is a kind of power that they are determined to have about usage right now. Yes, to your point, and I've heard what you have described so many times, that someone is either reading the word, repeating the word, describing a particular context. That matters not to some people. The word should not be uttered. My concern is that the wounds that these young people have carried, I'd rather attend to that and help them see that there is a wound here that we should be attentive to, and not policing the word. The policing of the word will not help you. It won't save you. It changes very little in their minds. And I think sort of in our lived experience, it doesn't change much if we police the word in the context in which you describe. But we also have to attend to the harm that's been done to them so that they can also see that you may have been called that word and we have to deal with that. But to continue to sort of traffic in, you can't say it, you can't say it. Now, to people who want to use it, I would question you. Why would you want to use it outside of a context of, that we've already described? But I do think that even, and I don't really want to talk about wokeness, but I even think some of that energy is absolutely about reclaiming a kind of power that, many of them have either never heard of. I mean, I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and I felt good about being a Black person. And I thought that people who were coming behind me did too. Turns out many of them do not. Many of them did not. And it was only in this racial awakening that we realized, oh shit, they don't feel so good about who they are as young Black people. And that was not something that was really going to be explored. So you're now encountering students, I am too, with whom I find this kind of awkward dance that we're doing around language, but ignoring some of the real undercurrents of what they feel. So I would wish that we would do less policing of the word and have more space to deal with how they really feel. But also at some point, Lance, I would love to talk about the difference between, and there's a wonderful work of art that an artist, and I was trying to think of his name, and there's a poster and he writes something like, I'm paraphrasing, there's a huge difference, ER versus A. Like, so for Black people in particular, huge difference. And I was really intrigued by your discussion. I thought that was one of the, for me, the best parts of the book, where you tried to, where you articulated. I hate that you tried, but you articulated the differences between the two and came to the conclusion that there are two different words. I don't, again, you use language,
Different
I think,
words.
more depth, right? But that they are different.
Yeah.
And that's a really big thing that I was hoping to get to today.
I would say that another willful suspension of logic is somebody who says, how come they can use the word and I can't? When it's obvious that it's a different word completely. I don't think anybody sincerely misses that, but that kind of pollutes our discussion of the whole thing. To me, they're different lexical entries.
I want to express skepticism on that point.
Really?
Yeah.
You think
Because-
people really don't get that difference?
Well, could I say the A version?
No.
Right. So I don't think they're really different words. I think they're different meanings for the same word. It seems, I mean, that's how it seems to me. And that we do use words in different contexts in different ways. They have multiple meanings,
But you readily understand why you can't use the A.
Oh, sure.
Right. Or the ER.
right. But the fact that it's not different, that strikes me as that then it's not really a different word. It's just, and sometimes with the in-group uses a word and does it in a way that it has a different meaning within that context than when it's uttered by someone outside of the group.
We're getting into semantics and labeling here, of course.
Yeah.
I wonder if a person listens to Black boys on the subway, the way they use the word, and wonders why, a white person listens to that and wonders, why can't I use the N word with the ER at the end? I think if anybody asks that question, I think they're expressing a more general frustration with our racial politenesses and things. I always feel that they couldn't really not understand that. Maybe I'm putting myself into their heads.
No, but what I mean is that they're not, the A and the ER are not different.
If I may,
Very different something.
I think they're completely different. And I maybe again, lived experience maybe helps meet that out. I mean, I'll-
talk louder, please?
Oh.
Yeah, just
Is
bring
that
it.
better? Even better still? No?
No. Good.
Okay. And you do, I think, try to, again, you do articulate this in the book, again with the trying. Lance, to your point, would you be surprised if I told you that I use it? Meaning, if I were to use a version of the word, would I be using it as a racial slur? If my 70-something-year-old mother, who was the brightest woman I've ever met, petite, church-going, interesting, she occasionally uses the A word.
Yeah.
And maybe it's possible that the context in which we use it is so sort of anathema, like you can't imagine it. But I'm just here to tell you that it is used with frequency amongst different generations in very different contexts. If I'm with my girlfriends and we say, "Oh, that nigga's fine," is it the same thing as ER? It cannot be. For me, it cannot be. Now, I can understand that there is some capacity for, and you allude to this, John, that we are trying to get at something else when we say it's the same word. But I just, in a very embodied way, I can tell you that I'm not going to call another Black person ER. It's never going to happen, ever. But I will absolutely say, in many different contexts, and for me, it is, you use this phrasing of a magic word. It is a kind of magic word because there is no other word like it. When I say it, I mean something very specific and unnameable. There's no other equivalent. I do not use it in what we used to call mixed company, meaning I would never use it in front of another group of white people. I just wouldn't, because it's just not, it's something that's so personal and so intimate, and it is often illegible to people outside of your intimate context. So it's like any other word, when you don't want to be misunderstood, right? You don't use language that would then be interpreted or misinterpreted in a way that, right? So it would be strange if I walked into the office and say, "Hey, my nigga, right, Lance," that would be, right?
Sure.
It would be completely, not even inappropriate, it would be gross, because it portends a particular relationship that we don't have.
Right.
So this is all in the service of saying that it is definitely two different words. Of course, the words can be connected, but many words can be connected. Many words can be related. Many words can have similar, right, origins and contexts even, but still be very, very different. And I feel like sometimes I wish that we were in each other's, and part of what film and media is in some ways, is it allows us to inhabit spaces. I would not know, even though I am a girl who grew up in Baltimore and always around Jewish people, wanted to go to Hebrew school because I saw my Jewish friends going there, thinking, what are they learning at Hebrew school?
I
Sounds
always
great,
wondered that too.
right? So this idea of proximity still does not allow me to fully know the inner workings of what happens in the Catskills. So I get to see that in Maisel, but likewise, there are spaces for Black people, but those spaces are often intruded upon and not seen as viable, right? If we sort of meet together and have our own spaces and our own language, somehow there's this kind of sense of ownership of those spaces still. So there's so many directions we could go.
I don't disagree with any of that. I would just say that, every group can adopt terms that are used against them by others in a derogatory sense, and within the in-group use them in a way that is meant, that's either humorous or just, turn the meaning into something different.
And
Lance,
just one last quick thing, John. Imagine you having Yiddish and all of the expanse that allows. We don't have that.
Oh, yeah.
We don't have that. And so we are using language in ways that is sort of amorphous to try to make something out of English do what it was never intended to really do, if that makes sense.
It does, and I have no, quarrel with that. It's just that point of what constitutes a different word. It's sort of like a linguistic question. Really.
this is the question I wanted to ask you. This is a genuine question. Are disrespect and dis the same word or different words? To me, dis, which seems to have really settled in since the early 90s, I think of that as now a separate lexical entry with a very specific meaning, although if you are over about 25, you know that dis started as short for disrespect. To me, the ER and the A version of these words are like that. They're that distinct to me. But to you, is this a different word or is it the same word? Because, you know, where
I
you draw the line.
never thought about that, so I don't know. I'm not sure.
And it's because it's a where do you draw the line?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, where would you, I mean, you come from linguistics, so what constitutes a word and when does a word become a different word?
But as you know, it's not quantum physics, and so there's no one place, but dis has such a specific meaning that I would say that it is not the word disrespect. It's something handier and more specific. And so I would say a new word was born of what started out as funny slang in the 80s. To me, the A word is like that. Of course, it came from the ER word, but it sounds like it, but it's just not the same. And so that's the way I don't know why I suddenly did that accent, but that is, it just came out.
I think that was a carryover from Dick Van Dyke.
I don't know what that was. I don't know who that was, but that is how I've always thought of it myself.
Well, I was also going to ask what you all thought about, because I'm still thinking a lot about comedy too, and I don't know if anyone has watched Gerard Carmichael's HBO special. I strongly, strongly recommend it. He sits.
See that one? Go ahead.
He was the host of Saturday Night Live recently, but he sort of stands on a stage and talks about. There are lots of spoilers which I don't want to give away, but it was kind of evocative of Richard Pryor, but in a much more introspective, less performative way. And he is talking about himself, he's talking about his life and the particulars of his life, and using the N word, F word, the F slur, as my students are want to remind me, not the F word, the F slur, and
I get it. Right.
yeah, right. And the usage of the A, N-word A, I don't like saying it because that's the other thing, Lance. I don't necessarily like the word, but I find, and this to me goes to your book, I find the need to use it. So liking a word, and so this idea of saying it in public spaces, and when I was growing up, young men wouldn't say it as much in front of women or in front of older people. So I think there's also this line of not really liking the word or liking how we feel about a word, and then trying to then truncate its usage and censor it. And so I think so much of this has to do with us not being able to deal with any of what we feel, and we take it out on language. But again, that's a very sort of, it's like a dead end street, because it's useful, as you point out, to learn about language and what it does for us and what it allows. But at the same time, if it stops there and it truncates social intimacy, it truncates our capacity for connection and for understanding, then that's when there's sort of a problem for me. You had an interesting bit.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I'm sorry you missed it.
Yeah,
Their question.
okay, sure, please. Question is, who's calling? Is it for me? If it's for me, I'm busy.
I by mistake touched somebody last January on the subway, going to the subway.
Would you mind standing up?
No, yes.
Oh, okay. It's hard to see.
I am sitting. I inadvertently touched somebody on the escalator on the subway going down to 59th Street. I tapped him on the shoulder because he was on my way. I thought he had his earbuds in, so I thought he couldn't hear me. I said, "Excuse me," and I went like this, and he followed me all the way into the car. And he said to me, he called me, he said to me, "I'm gonna kill you, nigga." Why was he calling me a nigga? N-I-G-G-A.
It's a good question.
You know, actually, The word is really spreading in
Yeah.
what it can apply to, and that's what words do. And we've got a very complex racial situation. I have heard white guys using it among one another on the street when they think no one's listening. I've seen what are probably Filipino guys using it. And I say in the book that white mountain men used to call each other that affectionately, the idea being we're as lowly as those people. It is now being used in reference to animals. And so somebody will talk about a wasp stinging them and saying nigger came up and bit me or something like that. And it's also being used as a pronoun. And so it's a weird usage, but I've heard this enough that I can tell it's really settled in. And so a nigga didn't even have any food in his house. And it means him. He's referring to himself. And so a nigga is becoming a pronoun. Apparently now it's being used to address just anybody who bothered you or who was perceived that way. And therefore you become that. And so we're seeing the word changing in that way. I've never seen it. What you're talking about is new on me. But then again, when you hear something that odd, you see something else like it the next week. That's probably just the way it's spread. You were this. Don't take this wrong, but you were the wasp. Like you were the quote unquote animal that annoyed him, and I can tell you didn't mean to. But I think that's why he was referring to you that way. If that makes sense. And by wasp, I mean the insect.
Yeah, that was an interesting one.
I know,
I didn't mean that.
That could
Like
apply. I know, that's what
I was thinking, does it sound like that? Right. And the wasp.
But if I can add one more thing to your point, I think it's also a way, again, to sort of redistribute power and almost pain as well, right? That it's kind of a leveling, right?
You're the right.
Right. And that it is something that I don't think it's quite as literal as you may have felt it, meaning like he called you that, but I do think it is a way to allow people to now there's a kind of leveling of the playing field, so to speak. And it's not just, I think it's more commonly used than we might think. I hear it a lot, that it's I heard it, there's a film that uses it. And I was trying to recall the film and I could not, where there's a white man, and somebody will know this, maybe put my colleague on the spot. Brandy, somebody will know that there's a film with, it's not Beau Bridges, but he sort of yells at a group of white people and says something like, "You're all niggers." And they're like, "What?"
You mean an old film or a new?
It's a 1970s film.
It's whatchamacallit. Is it
The
The Landlord?
Landlord.
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay, there
you
you
got
go.
it.
It's one of the best films ever made, I recommend.
The landlord?
The Landlord, it's late 60s, it's Hal Ashby, and it is Park Slope before it became Park Slope. It is a perfect film and also beautiful color. Go ahead.
No, great. I'm glad we got to it, the name. But the idea also for me is part of this question around why can't I say it also rings very strange, I think, to many Black people, not to speak for all of us, of course, but the idea that you could be told that there is something you can't say, that there is something you can't do, that there is a kind of privilege in being able to say whatever you think to whomever. And so there's certainly a power dynamic that the N-word in all of its forms tries to push and disturb and disrupt and upend. And as I said before, it does things that no other word can do. It has like an unending capacity. And remember the chart in your book where you sort of, it makes me think about that it can be used in many ways. I think I could probably add a few entries to that chart. There are ways that every day, right? It keeps morphing and changing. And so what you're describing is another sort of iteration of it. But it's going to, and I think it has an unending lifespan so long as we continue to suppress so much of our racial animus and anxiety. I think if that anxiety, if the context were broadened and expanded and we could understand and see more about how race operates, I think the usage would go down. Now, I have no reason to, there's no science behind that, but it is this kind of utterance that is kind of suppressing all of the stuff that's bubbling in sort of the undulating racial ecosystem. So it's like, it's going to continue to have a life so long as we keep trying to stifle it, I think, and stifle what it represents.
And I think part of that is that they don't teach you how to do it.
No,
You know,
Not allowed?
it's
I have
sort
something
of
to say
going
that
into this
relates.
blind, I think. And
You're a
you know,
coward.
they don't, I think things happen so quickly, there isn't enough time to even process the change. I mean, I think, having been a teacher most of my life, I'm constantly trying to be even more aware of what I say in the classroom, And when I brought up the incident, with the student from Haiti, what also bothered me is she didn't think that I had any cause for offense, for someone to put those lyrics into an epic that some people consider almost a sacred book, that I didn't take offense of that, I mean, there was a part of me that felt like, I didn't want to, sorry. No, there was a part of me that felt like, like I didn't want to censor anyone. So there are times, I think, when the context has to be seen by both parties and not make one sort of the perpetrator and then sort of act like I'm the victim of that when there's much more to it. I just find that more and more I'm beginning to feel that language is losing nuance, that somehow meaning has become in some sense very absolute. And I don't know, but I think in the digital sphere in particular, language almost stands alone without context. And I'm not sure what your thoughts are on that, but you take something like Twitter, like in 280 characters, from all the media stuff about, form shaping content, seems to ring very true, particularly in the digital sphere. And, that worries me, that, again, the lack of really, I think, deep meaning or deep interpretation when language. The other issue too that I'm wondering about, as well as language in the digital sphere, is the use, I guess, of emojis and almost like returning to pictographic ways of communicating. And what is that going to do? You can express anger, with all these, faces and whatnot. You need to learn how to decode those now, I find. So I'm just curious, looking into our current digital era and the role of language.
Well, the digital era also is about there being a larger role in the public sphere for casual and informal
Yes.
language, and inherently, casual language is less objective. Casual language is more subjective. It's more subject to the roiling nature of humanity, and we are vague, and we are constantly changing. And there's a whole lot of nuance there, as opposed to the cold objectivity of cool, controlled print. So I think part of what we're seeing is that we're talking more than writing, even when we're writing. So that's the essence of our era. That's a lot of what I think you're seeing.
Right.
although print is a hot medium.
Print, yeah, I was just about to say,
Hot.
according to McWhorter.
Yeah. But, on that question that was brought up, it made me think there's, we've been talking a lot about, say, the N word as an insult, or the other N word, I'll give you that, as a statement of identity. But, that example is where it's used outside of those contexts as something to throw at someone else. And it made me think of the way that some people have used Jew as a verb. And I didn't encounter this till I went away to college, and then find people who say, I Jewed him out of this, or I Jewed him down. And And then later understanding that gyp is also a slur, which we all did as kids, you know, he gypped me, you know, and then, you know, I'm one who goes around telling people when I hear it, you shouldn't say that because that's against Gypsy Romani.
Right.
And I guess, I mean, nobody really cares about the British, but Welsh, you know, is in that same category.
Exactly.
So that really is a kind of different category though than using it as a direct insult against people.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, these things are almost never only about Black America. These are often general processes that you can see in other subcultures, other cultures in general. That's what makes it interesting to me, to see that all these things are typical and systematic, and they often seem exotic just because we're fish you don't know we're wet. And often, if you pull the camera back, you can see that nothing is that new under the sun.
Well, we can take some more questions, and I'm just going to note, Terry, that microphone
Does that work?
no, it's for the live stream. And-
Oh, sorry.
Okay, but we had some other hands up before, yeah.
Hi, my question isn't, why can't we use these words, but why should we use these words? My question isn't, why can't we use these words versus why should we use these words? When Lance said, what the fuck, I don't even know what that sentence means, you know? Where we go, oh shit, like, is that a good way to express ourselves? Is this, you know, are we condoning these things? Are we saying this is the evolution of our language? You know, in the 40 years that I've been with general semantics, my understanding is we want better communication, better understanding, versus saying, hi John, I'm Lance, and why are you here today? Tell me more about your book. Tell me more about the thoughts about versus what the fuck, like, you know, so this colloquial language to me is guttural, right? It is a step backward. You know, how do we, you know, even accept this as language that is, you know, something that's acceptable versus, you know, more intelligent, more thoughtful, more expressive, more understanding, and eliminating misunderstanding.
To be honest, I see specificity and nuance in what these words have come to mean. And I know that's going to seem as if I'm being puckish or contrarian or trying to be modern, but I really feel it. And so, for example, what the fuck? That means something, because you could say, that really surprised me. That really caught me off guard. That's not what the fuck means. If I say what the fuck, like I walk into a room and there's something that makes me say that, what I mean is this is something that I really didn't expect. And in addition, I thought when I walked into this room that there wasn't going to be anything that I didn't expect. I'm amazed that I'm shocked in this setting, and I'm shocked as well. And the vernacular flavor of the fuck suggests that lots of other people who are just like me probably have the same response. You wouldn't say it if it was only you who was surprised. Now, of course, you don't think about any of those things, but I really wouldn't know any proper way of connoting what I would mean by walking into a room, looking at somebody, opening my jaws about halfway and saying, what the fuck? It means something. It's articulate.
No, I disagree. That's an assumption on my feeling with that expression. That may be how you feel, but that's a big assumption on how others might feel about the same situation, because I think there's a better way of expressing that.
What would that be?
Less misunderstanding.
What would that be?
Just being articulate. Like you said, I'm surprised about this. You know, this is a new situation. How do you feel about that?
I understand what you mean, and everybody will have their preferences, but the issue with language change is whether it gets to a point, and obviously that there is no metric here, but where it gets to the point that there's a general consensus that everyone is receiving it in the same way except a few, then the horse has left the barn. I'm not saying that I can decree that about this particular expression.
When I was a little girl, the word was shit. And now it's fuck.
Yeah,
In another 20 years, what is the word going to be?
and word. It's hard to say.
Can I add one more thing, Lance,
Yeah,
to this
please.
gentleman's question? I really do understand what you mean, and there's a part of me that agrees that if we had a broader command of language that was more expansive and more precise, that we'd be in a better place. But I think what the book also offers is an awareness that we are deeply feeling and emotive people who need vehicles to get that stuff out. And you even say something, John, about sort of it being our essence. Oh, I'm sorry, let's turn it this way.
Yeah.
There's something about it being part of our essence that we have to, and again, you say it very well in the book.
Thank you.
So I'm torn because I do think that language is useful, but I also know that I think this is not a knowing, this is a thinking, this is a sensibility that I have, that we have also overvalued language in a way that we think its utility is sort of unilateral. I think language is just oddly imprecise, and it doesn't always get at what I feel. And so to use whatever tools I have, yes, I do think though, it is important to be precise in certain spheres, which is why I personally don't sort of use it and wield it everywhere. No, it is absolutely subject to context, where I am. If I'm in a space where this word will make me more legible to this person, then I'll use it. If I'm in a place where I need to say this thing this way, then I have to be much more thoughtful about how I deploy certain words. Because I think, to your point, if we wield it willy-nilly, it feels gross and unthoughtful. But there are moments in film studies, we used to use this old word called jouissance, an unnameable pleasure that you get in watching something. But there's also an unnameable pleasure in using a word that bonds you to someone. And sometimes these words strangely do that. But in particular context, not willy-nilly everywhere on the subway. I don't encourage that. I certainly didn't teach my children to do it that way. You try to grapple for language that really says what you feel. But sometimes what the fuck is the thing that makes it work, and it makes me connect to you in a way that we just can't often make sense of.
Yeah.
Well,
I think
I would
that-
agree.
Yeah.
But I think that's why you have metaphor and poetry. I think those are ways I'm just saying that language,
Turn the mic.
I think, sorry, that language, is incapable in many ways of, I think, describing the ineffable. And I think it's at those times that you sort of resort to changing language, I think using metaphor, poetry. Certainly, I think, is some bridge at least, I think, between sort of, passion and reason, I guess, just.
It's also where we get into euphemism, a while back, there was a digital billboard on the Cross Bronx from coming home, and, kind of thing that almost makes me want to crash, but there's a movie title, and I remember looking at it, Whiskey Tango Foxtrot. So it's Tina Fey. And it's just like, I passed it a few times, and then suddenly it dawned on me, it's WTF.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Right.
but it was a great way to sort of disguise it.
She has a question.
Thank you. My question is, along the lines of what Becca said, I'm kind of offended when I'm walking down the street and two young men are walking, they're dressed beautifully. They're obviously educated and well employed. And they're walking down the street and every other word is that. That. I mean, it's part of, it's almost like I don't know what it is, but it's not language to me. I agree with what was just said. If, I never use that word or any of these words, but if I'm really frustrated, I'm really upset, I'll say, and it's like, I understand it under that context, but what is this conversational? This is a dialogue. Two young men are walking down the street with that handshake cases, and they can't use a whole sentence without three F's. That is not to me communicating. They're not upset, they're not whatever. That's part of their new vernacular. And it doesn't enhance, I think, that there are people today. I mean, I look at them and I wonder what and why do you feel it necessary to do that? Are they looking for attention? Are they looking to want that the other person's down? To you? And my husband and I bought your book at dinner.
Oh, thank you.
If I had known you would be here, I probably should have known. I would have brought the book.
You could buy another one.
You buy another one.
I knew you were gonna say that because you're silly.
You know, actually, to tell you the truth, I know those guys you're talking about. And it's,
What are
they're,
their names?
oh, those guys? That's Caleb and Brian. Yeah, I know them. And they especially do it, you know, after a drink or two after work. And they're not using the word you're using. And now we're back to that whole issue.
No, they're not.
And if you think about it, there's a difference between, if I may, get out of here, get the fuck out of here, and the fuck out of here. Those are three different sentences, and it's not just that two of them are dirty. Get the fuck out of here has more force, and it also implies that there are other people who wish you would leave too. No one says it, but that's what language is like. Now, if you can't say get the fuck out of here because you think of it as profane, to me, you're in the situation that you're in with any language where you hit a lexical gap. And so, for example, you have an event out of town that you don't want to go to, and you find out that the event is
Still
canceled.
not available.
Canceled at the last minute. And so you're relieved because you don't have to go to Michigan or whatever it was. You're glad. That's a particular kind of relief when it comes at the last minute and you think, oh, I can now make dinner. I don't have to go to the airport. It's not just relief. I'm sure there are languages that have a word for exactly that wonderful rosy feeling you have when something is canceled at the last minute that you didn't want to do. We don't have a word for it. And, you know, we live, but it's a lexical gap, just like in French, there's no way to say something is sticking out. There's no such thing as that chair is sticking out of the row of the others. You can talk your way around it. There's no verb for that. They get along. If there were no way to say, get the fuck out of here in English, I think it would be poorer for it. And to just say it louder would not be as articulate as this extremely extended usage of this word for sexual intercourse to mean that. And actually in the book, I had 16 uses of that word, where as dirty as they are, it's hard not to see a certain kind of art in them. But it's not just saying fuck over and over again. It's made its way into being something much deeper. A linguist would have a field day figuring out just what the role is of the fuck in each one of those sentences. It's a fun thing. I hear you, really, especially if you're from the time when the word was shit. Like maybe I'm a little younger, and so it's easier for me to not hear it that way. But it's really just language change to me.
So is it 16 different words, really?
No, it's maybe 4 different words, but they are different from what the word means. Yeah.
Okay. Could take more questions.
This young lady was next.
Yeah, please.
All right. Thinking in response to your question, I mean, we're both 21. We were raised in a house where we couldn't swear. My mom even said no SU combos, as in I couldn't say shut up to my brother. And I think going back, if at the time the word was shit and now it is fuck, it's just whatever word your friends are using that you're not allowed to use at home. And I've seen psychological studies that swearing does relieve some stress and some pressure. So if I'm complaining about my job and I'm saying I'm fucking exhausted, the admin is so fucking like, I don't know, annoying about something, like it is some type of stress relief that we get. And I understand that it does seem incivil, but say we're walking down the street in Manhattan, I will swear unless I see like a baby in a carriage coming towards me, or an elementary school on a field trip. I'll try not to swear in front of them because our parents raised us not to swear around other kids or even to our younger siblings. But it does feel like when you're in the adult sphere, you're more able to participate with that language. And it's like when you turn a certain age, when you leave your house more, you're more able to use language that's in that sphere that's relating to like universal experiences where we're all like, what the fuck is going on? Okay, I'm glad.
It's possible I've read it elsewhere, but I've been telling people I read it in your book. And I just found it again on page 3, that it's a whole different part of the brain.
Yes, it's that was interesting.
They're not words. Yeah, they're eruptions. They come from the
The
right.
right brain.
Yeah,
Oh, that is
and that's,
interesting.
and so you think of it as a word, but really it's an eruption. Yeah, and that kind of explains that use of the N word that made so little sense. It's like it's becoming an eruption in that way. Yeah.
And I wonder to the young lady's point right here, and even segueing back to you, sir, that I think for people of a certain class, of a certain sort of social expectation, and I don't just mean that you make a certain amount of money and you do, but that life sort of flows for you a certain way, this language maybe isn't as necessary. I would argue that it's part of everybody's internal experience, but I think for people, when you talk about feeling annoyed or frustrated, there's a certain kind of access that younger people want to emotion now. They don't want everything to be suppressed. And we used to operate according to certain social mores that you didn't say it here, you didn't say it right. And a lot of that is just being upended. People don't necessarily want to feel constrained and restricted. And sometimes that's awkward and difficult. Some people will walk by kids and babies and say it to anybody or your grandmother's around, right? So this, as you say, this kind of evolution is happening and it's uncomfortable sometimes. There are places where I'm like, oh my gosh, enough, right? And it feels out of place and overused. And then there are times when it is this kind of, again, this utterance that needs to be released. And so the awkwardness of that and the discontinuity of that doesn't always feel great. But I do think that there is something churning underneath that still summons us to think about our social relations and who we are in, public space. But you were gonna add something.
I wasn't, because that was very good.
Mike, you have a,
Yeah, I wanted to say a couple quick things, just that this is one of the most enjoyable panels I've attended in our community ever, and I'm enjoying it beyond belief. I'm very appreciative of the love you showed for plurality and literacy. It's one of my favorites as well.
Great book.
Great book. And I wanted to say that it seems to me, based on some reactions in the room and the content of the book and so forth, that we talk about these words of magic, but that spells are often cast unevenly and the effects are felt unevenly as well. So it's undoubtedly magic, but it's a different magic in different situations for different people. And I think that goes to explaining for Lance and I, for example, that the ER and the A, there's not a practical difference in those things. So those are not different words for us for practical purposes. There's no difference that makes a difference.
Mm-hmm.
But the magic working differently in different places, you easily can see how they're different words. And I think you articulated how that works beautifully. So I love the magic metaphor. I just, maybe I'm thinking of using it a little bit too much, but it strikes me that
I'm
that's the
glad
spell,
it works.
The spell we're all under is not exactly the same spell.
Exactly.
I'm back.
no,
Do you think?
we're gonna let someone else have a chance.
Oh,
Okay, Jackie?
When I listened to the young ladies talking about their use of the word, in my office, it's beneath the window, there's a gathering place for middle school, mostly boys and girls, I want to say at this point, after school, and the language is just unbelievable. And I listened just for so long, and then, and it's girls and boys, I will emphasize that. And after a certain length of time, well, first of all, are they just doing this to be important to each other or to shock, or I don't know. But after a certain length of time, I will go out there and say, hey, it's a grandma here. And they stop and they go. And it really works. So there's hope. I say, hey, this is a grandma here. And they go. So I think it's, I don't know, interesting. And also, I have a 3-year-old grandson who all too often playing go, what the? What the? I'm a little concerned. I don't say too much. What the? He's 3. So I said to his mom, I said, what's this what the? And she goes, oh, that's in all the cartoons. And I say, yes, there's no screens at our house.
That's
And that's
interesting.
where I have to say, well, not in our screens, but the cartoons apparently are saying, what the? In the
Right.
cartoons. So, I mean, what the?
They're gonna learn. I mean, when he's 11 or 12, he's gonna be doing it when you're not around.
Under my window, right?
Pretty much, yeah. Who's the hand back there?
Yeah.
I'm curious, and I'm just wondering, with the conversation, and we're talking about like this, a word that's just repeated so much, whatever. So have you had any thought of what, like in 50 years or, I don't know, 20 years, with these eruptions from the right side of the brain? What are your thoughts? What are your projections?
I think that possibly class is gonna come into these things. I think maybe we'll become a nation that talks more openly about issues of stratification, and that might create erupting insults different from the ones that we have now. I think, however, the ones about slurs are gonna settle in for a good long time. They're becoming grammar rather than words. All sorts of things are happening to those, and I think we really just need to wait and see with them. But the profanity of tomorrow, my guess would be about class and stratification, I think. And it's not the time to talk about it, but I think in 50 years, race is going to be less important, partly just because of the sheer force of hybridization in most parts of the country. Nevertheless, there will be issues of power, and I imagine that would be class, and therefore epithets will swarm around that sort of thing. And so a science fiction person would have to work on what those would be.
And do you think, like,
Probably.
with our discussion of the F word, do you think language is gonna be more narrow? Or
No,
will that not have an impact?
language will always flower. It's the nature of the beast. If anything,
Yes,
these,
of course. I'm sorry, I missed, of course, language is enormous power. But I'm just, talking maybe more about our, clarification of language and defining what you wanna say, or, like, this word can mean so many different things, is our usage and our thinking, because language
Yeah.
does define our thinking. Do you think that can affect our thinking?
well, that's a whole different rant, but I think that the way that you talk does affect your thinking to an extent, not as much as we often think. Language is an approximation of our thoughts. It floats above it and bubbles around. There's as much that language can't do as that it can. That's probably always been the case, and it's the case now. I'm not sure how that will change. That's the challenge of language. What do you two think about that?
About what, language?
Language and how accurately it expresses what we think and our
No, I
thoughts.
agree with you. I think like I said, I think when it has to deal with ineffable concepts, language fails us.
Mhm.
If you're talking about, say, something like the soul, like I teach Plato's Phaedrus, and, it's very interesting in the text, Plato is struggling, Socrates is struggling to describe the soul, and he has to resort to imagery and metaphor. And, the language actually waxes poetic in the text, because he can only describe the soul as something or like something, like, it's about the charioteer and black horse or white horse, et cetera, using that kind of imagery. So I've always felt that language has its limitations
Mhm.
in terms. But your question was more,
I'm
about-
just wondering too, could this make it fail us more by just, narrating or thinking? This is just a question for us to think about.
I'm just gonna jump in here, because I think this is a point of disagreement, because, going back to linguistic relativism is, which is the idea that language is what we think with. So I'm not sure what thoughts are that aren't linguistic, aside from, we perceive, you can sort of play or imagine music in your head, you can sort of run a kind of movie in your head. There are other forms of thought other than language, but much of what we call language is the little voice talking, where we're talking to ourselves in our head, and that, the way you explained about how French doesn't have a word for something sticking out. It's not that you don't notice it, it's not that you wouldn't notice that something is sticking out, but it does direct your thoughts in a certain way and your attention in a certain way. Howard Rheingold had a nice phrase for it: tools for thought.
Tools. Yeah.
But I think we'll take one last question, and then, did you want to ask your question now? Oh, no, I thought you did.
That was the question.
Oh, okay. Well, okay, last question, yeah.
It's not a question, really, but it's a comment that relates, I think, which is we all often confuse language as individual words with language as discourse. And there's an enormous amount you can do with discourse that you can't do with individual words, which, as Michelle rightly said, are extremely imprecise. You can never achieve perfect precision, but you can achieve much greater precision with discourse than with individual words. And the context changes completely.
It does.
Yeah, just to follow that very quickly, my sister relayed a hilarious story about my niece who was 7 and in, I don't know, 2nd grade, and she's a little black girl in Hagerstown, Maryland, and she came home from school and said, "Mom, a boy in my class called me the N-word." My sister's like, "Oh my gosh, what are we gonna do?" She said, "Okay, what happened?" My niece says, "He called me a nerd."
The N-word.
This idea of evolving context, and so my question was, where did my niece even learn the N-word as a reference?
Right.
So it's this idea that there is this evolution underfoot that, seems to go in strange directions, right? We can sort of predict in some ways, as you've tried to do, as you've done.
That's okay.
What is with me and try? But again,
I try hard.
it goes in these unexpected directions. That this little black girl was called a nerd, and not the N-word that we have come to understand it. So I do think that there are some ways in which language will continue to frustrate us, but that ultimately it is a tool that we have, and perhaps we're all learning how to use it in ways that make us both more legible and offer us some degree of expression and release, perhaps too.
Can I just tell a funny anecdote at the end? I was relating to your question about your grandson. My native language is Tamil, and we don't have actually a letter for the F sound. We only have P. So when my son wanted to use the F word, I said, "No, you cannot use that." So instead, he kept saying, "Puck you, puck you." So there is something to be said for bringing your children up bilingually.
That's the message. Right?
So, at least.
Well, thank you. I think we'll give John a chance to sign some books.
Yes.
And I want to thank you all for coming. I want to say thank you
you.
to our panelists, to Vasu, Michelle, and thank you and congratulations to John McWhorter.
Thank you, folks. Thank you.